Good morning, I'm Dwayne Wickham. I'm the Dean of the School of Global Journalism and Communication here at Morgan State University. 50 years ago, a commission was created by President Lyndon Johnson, and it issued a blistering report on the causes of the scores, in fact hundreds, of racial disturbances that broke out across this country in the decade of the 1960s. The so-called Kerner Commission warned that our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Today we join with West Virginia University's College of Media and Brigham Young University's School of Communications to engage our students and the viewers of this live stream event in the discussion of our nation's response to this grave warning. Over the course of this day, you will hear from students and panelists at this mostly black university, from participants at a mostly white rural university, and from our colleagues on the campus of a Western religion-based university. Our goal is not simply to talk about race in America from our unique perspectives, but also to listen to what others have to say on this subject. It is in listening that we hope to find common ground and meaningful solutions to this nation's original sin.
My fellow Americans, we have endured a week such as no nation should live through, a time of violence and tragedy. For a few minutes tonight, I want to talk about that tragedy, and I want to talk about the deeper questions that it raises for us all. I am tonight appointing a special advisory commission on civil disorders. Let there be no mistake about it. The looting and arson and plunder and pillage which have occurred are not part of a civil rights protest. There is no American right to loot stores, or to burn buildings, or to fire rifles from the rooftops. That is crime, and crime must be dealt with forcefully and swiftly, and certainly under law. Innocent people, Negro and white, have been killed. Damage to property owned by Negroes and whites is calamitous. Worst of all, fear and bitterness which have been loosed will take long months to erase. The criminals who committed these acts of violence against the people deserve to be punished, and they must be punished. But when violence strikes, then those in public responsibility have an immediate and a very different job, not to analyze, but to end disorder. That they must seek to do with every means at our command, through local, through police and state officials, and in extraordinary circumstances where local authorities have stated that they cannot maintain order with their own resources, then through federal authority that we have limited authority to use. To those who are tempted by violence, I would say this. Think again. Who is really the loser when violence comes? Whose neighborhood is made of shambles? Whose life is threatened most? And if you choose to tear down what other hands have built, you will not succeed. You will suffer most from your own crime. You will learn that there are no victors in the aftermath of violence. The apostles of violence, with their ugly drumbeat of hatred, must know that they are now heading for ruin and disaster.
The moderator for this opening session of our Kerner Plus 50 Symposium is Jason Johnson. Dr. Johnson is also an associate professor here at Morgan State University in our School of Department of Multimedia Journalism. You may know him well from his appearances on MSNBC. Dr. Johnson.
I'm very excited about this for a lot of different reasons, and I want to make sure that we sort of understand the context of what we're going to be focusing on this morning at Morgan State. It's interesting, we just saw that segment there from LBJ as he sort of, in my view, condescendingly lectured black people in this country about how we respond to systematic violence and racial oppression. Part of why the president was able to do that is because the coverage of these uprisings, and I will primarily use the term uprising, was always viewed through the lens of white Americans. That the vast majority of news departments and newspapers and television stations and radio stations at the time were almost exclusively white and primarily male. And the Kerner Commission actually spent an entire chapter discussing how media coverage had a lot to do with what and how America responded to the uprisings, the hundreds of uprisings, large and small, that occurred around the country. So our panelists today, and I'll give you a brief bio of each of them, we will be discussing not only those uprisings, but we'll be discussing how your role today is similar to what was called upon by the Kerner Commission 50 years ago, and what must be done to change how oppression is viewed, how the black community is viewed, and how our response, whether it turns to violence or whether it's protest, is actually depicted in the popular media. Beginning to my immediate left is Dr. Kay Wise Whitehead. She is known for having an informed opinion about issues that are happening within Baltimore City and around the country. Passionate, edgy, and unapologetic, Dr. Kay writes monthly op-eds in the Baltimore Sun and the Afro. She also is the host of a daily talk show on WEAA-FM, Today with Dr. Kay at Morgan State University from 3 to 5 p.m., which I've been on from time to time. And she is the author of 6 books. 6 books. And her forthcoming book, Dispatches from Baltimore, The Birth of the Black Mommy Activist. So, look forward to that next year. Rochelle Rye, next is my colleague, E.R. Shipp. Professor E.R. Shipp is a journalist, scholar with advanced degrees from Columbia University, a founding faculty member of the School of Global Journalism and Communication at Morgan State University, where she currently directs the school's Baltimore Reporting Project. She is a 1996 recipient of the Pulitzer Prize, considered one of the most prestigious awards in American journalism, and is the first black woman to receive the Pulitzer Prize in the category of commentary. She currently pens a bi-weekly column for the Baltimore Sun and is a frequent commentator on public radio. And last but not least is Rochelle Riley. She's a columnist for the Detroit Free Press. She's the author of, so we can all see it, The Burden, African Americans and the Enduring Impact of Slavery, from Wayne State University Press in 2018. Her columns were included in a package that won the Pulitzer Prize for the Detroit Free Press in 2009. She was also a 2016 inductee into the Michigan Journalism Hall of Fame. Please, a quick round of applause for this fantastic panel. Okay, so I'm going to begin. Each one of these panelists has sort of their own area of expertise. So I'm going to begin with Dr. Kay at the end. If you could, we're celebrating 50 years since the Kerner Commission report is an extensive report. There's a lot of history about how it was made, how it was responded to by the president. Could you give us just a look at sort of the history of the report and before we even get to its legacy?
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. It's a pleasure to be on the committee and to have this opportunity to speak. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to my students from Loyola University, Maryland, who have joined us. So it's exciting to have 4 universities participating in this very, very important event. So I think as we talk about the Kerner Commission, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders that was organized by President Johnson, and we did take a look at his condescending attitude towards black people, lecturing us about how we should respond to racial injustice, to systemic inequalities. It's the same condescending tone that we saw in the height of Black Lives Matter, coming from Barack Obama, coming from other leaders about what was happening in our communities and the ways in which we responded. So that condescending attitude is not new. It's also not something that only happens within the white gaze of white Americans. It happens across the board. And when you look at the Kerner Commission, the way that I was taught the Kerner Commission by Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture is that the real question they were trying to answer is, how do we get black people to stop tearing stuff up? How do we get them to quiet down? What exactly do they want? They called it a mandate to study the causes of rioting in the ghettos. And of course, we would put the quotation marks around the ghettos. In 1968, when they released their report in March, it was a month before Dr. King was assassinated. It was only a few months before Senator Kennedy was assassinated. And as a response to that, it only drove home the point they were trying to make when they released this report that was rejected by President Johnson. This notion that we are becoming two societies. And if you step back for a moment and you think about what was happening between 1965 and 1968, just kind of the latter years of the civil rights movement, the Kerner Commission identified about 150 riots. Think also that this is after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been passed, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So there were things happening within our communities. There was legislation happening. It was the work that we were building on from Thurgood Marshall. It was the work of all the nameless, footless soldiers that were out in the communities doing the work, footless in terms of writing out reports, writing out op-eds, nameless in terms of actually out on the street, marching, sometimes without Dr. King, because Dr. King, of course, could not be everywhere, and sometimes Dr. King and other leaders would have to run and get in front of the march because the people were already on the move. In 1967 alone, which is why the commission was put together, more than 1,800 people, mostly black people, were injured in these uprisings happening across the world and in our community. And I say across the world because people were standing in solidarity in Ghana with what was happening here. It wasn't just something that was particular to America. People understood, particularly because of the pictures coming out of the UN about the ways in which they were seeing dogs attack children. And these were shared worldwide through the media, which I know my colleagues will speak about. In '67, 83 people were killed. And across the country, there are roughly $120 million in damages. Now, I tend not to put damages up there to property with the damages to the spirits of people. But I think it's important to note that that's what President Johnson was speaking about. When he talked about you're going to be stopped, you're not going to get away with it, he was not talking about the injuries to black people. He was talking about the images that were being portrayed around this country of the damage to white-owned companies. The additional part that I want to add as we lay out our framing and our understanding is that there were 6 goals of the Kerner Commission. And I want you to think deeply about whether any of these goals have been achieved. The first goal was to reduce poverty. The second was to reduce inequality. The third goal was to reduce racial injustice. The fourth was to reduce crime. The fifth goal was to reduce fear, because there was a growing fear among white Americans about this danger of losing their country and losing control, I think, of the narrative. And then the sixth goal, which is what we're going to talk about today, was to create a more responsible media, less controlled by corporate interests, trying to figure out what exactly do people want, black people in particular. The Kerner Commission said if we're going to solve this goal, they actually believed that we could buy ourselves out of racial injustice. We could buy ourselves out of racism and white supremacy. And they put a price tag on it, $20 billion. They said if the government would just invest $20 billion, and to make that clear, today, that would be the equivalent of about $70 billion. If you put this money into the black community, you increase jobs, you increase housing opportunities, you increase educational opportunities, we can begin to turn this country around. But think about what that means. The 3 things they focused on: give people good jobs, and what are people talking about today? You give people better educational opportunities for their families, and you give people better opportunities to move forward in this country. That if you do these things, you spend that money, then we can solve this problem. The Eisenhower Foundation, which was created coming out of the Kerner Commission, and their job was to do follow-ups. So 30 years later, they did a follow-up to say, well, was the Kerner Commission correct? Are we still becoming 2 nations, one white, one black, separate and unequal? 30 years later, they said it's the same issue. We are still divided. In fact, America is becoming blacker and browner and poorer than ever, 30 years after Kerner. They did a follow-up again in 2008, after the election of Barack Obama. They said perhaps this country is really moving towards a point where we are coming together. And what they found in 2008 around the issues of poverty and injustice and the rising mass industrial prison system, that things were worse in 2008 than they were when the original Kerner Commission came out. And I want to end by noting that a follow-up study was done this year. 50 years later, where are we with the Kerner Commission? Are we still becoming two societies? One black, one white, separate and unequal. The new Kerner Commission said that we're actually worse today than we were 50 years ago. That we are now three societies, black, white, and brown. We are poorer than ever. We're more divided than ever around the issues of housing, education, and jobs, the very same issues that the Kerner Commission talked about 50 years ago.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kay. There's a way I sort of want to encapsulate this, and I think it's important when you understand what these kinds of commissions do and what they often call for. Dr. Kay talked a lot about how the Kerner Commission said, throw money at the problem, that'll fix it, right? And there's an old movie, and it's old for you students. Other people in this room might remember this movie. It was this old movie called I'm Gonna Get You Sucker. You guys ever seen that movie? Right? And so you remember the scene where he goes to the old black nationalists, and he says, what happened? Y'all were 1,000 strong. And the guy says, well, we all marched on City Hall.
And got jobs.
And we came out with jobs, right? And that ended the revolution. There is always this sort of belief by the government that if you employ brown people, that we will shut up and that somehow magically injustice ends. But it doesn't end, even when we're employed, even when we're able to step into the system, which leads us to our second panelist. So Professor Shipp became a journalist just a little over a decade after the Kerner Commission. She was sort of at the vanguard of black people, specifically black women, who entered media at this point. And so what I want to ask you is, how did the Kerner Commission have an impact, or did it have any impact on newsrooms? Were people talking about this still when you entered the newsroom, or was it considered some sort of old apocrypha that didn't need to be paid attention for one way or another?
Oh no, we were definitely very much aware, whether we called it the after effect of the Kerner Commission report or not, we were all very much aware that we were entering a brave new world that still didn't quite know how to handle us. Now, I entered mainstream journalism in 1980, so that would be 12 years after Kerner. And I started my career at the New York Times, which is considered like the pinnacle of American journalism by some. When I arrived at the New York Times, the newspaper had just settled a lawsuit that had been brought by women. But they were in the middle of a lawsuit that had been brought by black people. And they were saying at that time that the New York Times was not doing what it should be doing to recruit, retain, and promote black people who were on the staff there. That was true of many of the major news operations at the time. Some of them had a few black people there. I've heard Dean Wickham mention that many news organizations thought that if they had one, that was sufficient to satisfy those who were criticizing them. But when you went into these news organizations, you were not expected to bring your blackness through the door. So that was another one of the battles that we were fighting. So there was a fight to be hired, to keep your job, and to thrive in your job the way our white counterparts were doing, particularly white male counterparts. And then there was this push to see if we could help to influence the way the black community was covered. The New York Times opened a bureau in Harlem, in New York City, in the 1970s, before I got there. And it actually petered out by 1980. There was not that much will to do it. Now, perhaps because the New York Times focused most of its energies on national and international news, as well as business and financial news, the local coverage was always a bit, of a second thought. But it was particularly so when it came to trying to figure out what black people, and then later what black and brown people were focused on, what the issues were. The mainstream media of the day essentially thought that if they made a major push around February for Black History Month, if they covered some major crime, if they covered politicians coming through to talk about their urban agendas, maybe every now and then if they give us some kind of nice feature story on some cute little black kid doing something, that was sufficient. So that battle continued throughout my time at the New York Times, which was 13 years, and it was going on in other newsrooms around the country, both in newspapers, television stations, and radio stations. It's a battle that continues as media begins to try to figure out where it's going in terms of how it's organized, how the news is distributed. We're finding that the question is still here: how do you recruit, retain, promote people of color, and how do you cover the communities?
I want to add something to this, something I've mentioned in some of my classes, and I strongly encourage you all to look up this story. And it's great in particular because Professor Shipp was at the New York Times. It is absolutely essential to remember exactly what she said. It's not just about hiring. It's about how African Americans are recruited, how they're retained, how they're promoted. There's a really compelling story about how this continues to fail from about 15 years ago with a guy named Jason Blair. And how the sort of hackneyed attempts to get one special black person in news environments is sort of lifted up by many mainstream news outlets. Look what we did, look what we did. And of course that person is also used as a cudgel to beat other people out. Right. And that's a very important story you all should look up. Plus I went to high school with the guy, so I remember people used to confuse us. It was really strange. And with that idea in mind, Rochelle Riley has a lot of experience with the American Association of News Editors, and the idea that even when you get black reporters, right, even when you see black people on television, even when you see the Don Lemons of the world or this person or that person making a comment, much of news is still determined by the men and occasional women who are upstairs. And so I'd like Ms. Riley to talk a little bit about the American Association of News Editors and how things have or have not changed in the sort of back rooms of media, the editors and the managers and the publishers.
Thank you, Jason, and I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about this. I want to start by saying that I view the Kerner Commission report, particularly the chapter that it devoted to blaming the media, I treat it the same way that I do the annual report that women make less than men for doing the same jobs. We announce that very regularly and do nothing about it, which means it continues and continues and continues. Two of the most important sentences out of the Kerner Commission report were these. Their investigation established that virtually every major episode of violence was foreshadowed by an accumulation of unresolved grievances and by widespread dissatisfaction among Negroes with the unwillingness or inability of local government to respond. So the first thing they did was blame local governments. The second thing they did was said, we could have known about all of this if the media had just told us. The second one is one that the late Les Payne, who was one of the founders of the Monroe Trotter Group that I'm a member of, and that's a group of black columnists, national black columnists, who write with great pride that we are unapologetically black. And he pulled from the Kerner Commission report this particular fact, that in 1968, quote, the press has too long basked in a white world looking out of it, if at all, with white men's eyes and white perspective. And that's a part of the problem. When you have a commission led by a governor consisting mostly of white men who look to find out, oh Lord, what happened? And then they decide that what happened was these things were wrong, we didn't know, we need to fix it. So in addition to those 6 things that Dr. Kay gave you about the overall conditions of America, they had 6 things they wanted the American media to do. Now, mind you, we are not Russia, so they can't make the American media do anything. But what they asked them to do with great aplomb was to expand coverage of the Negro community and race problems through permanent assignment of reporters familiar with urban and racial affairs. Well, that was hard because they didn't have reporters like that. One of the big things that happened after each of these uprisings is that newspapers in particular, television stations in addition, had to find people in their building who they could send out into these neighborhoods. My friend Mervyn Augustman, who was a former president of the National Association of Black Journalists, which I'll talk about in a second, because it fell to associations of black people to try and do what the Kerner Commission said, because the white newspapers and white television stations weren't going to do it. He was a graphic artist in the newsroom in Louisville, Kentucky, the Courier-Journal. And they were burning down West Louisville. And so they said, well, Mervyn, we need you to take this notebook and go to West Louisville and report on what's happening. This is a graphic designer, no reporting experience, he's not a journalist. He will tell you the story, there's nothing wrong, except that's just not what he did. He's a brilliant artist. And he said, okay. Because had he said, man, people are shooting and I'm not going, we would never have known the things he was able to find out by being in his neighborhood, by being someplace where he felt safer. In the meantime, you've got white reporters who couldn't do it because they didn't do it when there wasn't looting and burning and a huge outpouring of frustration over the conditions that American black people lived in at that time. So that was one of the things. The second thing was integrate Negroes and Negro activities into all aspects of coverage and content, including newspaper articles and television programming. The third thing was recruit more Negroes into journalism and broadcasting and promote those who are qualified to positions of significant responsibility. Oh, and they said the recruitment should begin in high school. The fourth one was improve coordination with police in reporting riot news through advanced planning, which means they were expecting more. And cooperate with the police in the designation of police information officers, who are sometimes the greatest impediment to news, as crime reporters will tell you. And then accelerate efforts to ensure accurate and responsible reporting of racial news through adoption by all news gathering organizations of stringent internal staff guidelines. And finally, cooperate, and this was most important, in the establishment of a privately organized and funded Institute of Urban Communications to train and educate journalists in urban affairs, recruit and train more Negro journalists, and develop methods for improving police press coverage and to review coverage. That was never done. So, what we have here is still a failure to communicate. And the great myth that we have lived with in the United States is that this commission of these so-called smart men, there were some women, but mostly men, said that we were moving to be a separate society, one black and one white, as if we were ever not a separate society, one black and one white. We have never been a united society in America. Now, let me tell you the part that is the media's fault. Because the media did not have to cover all of America, it covered its society and the things it knew because they were mostly white. They had no idea what was going on in black communities because there's not one black community. There are black communities across America that the mainstream media knew nothing about. They didn't know what people went to church to talk about. They didn't know what the political standpoints were. They didn't even know what some of the cultural activities were, which is why we have in this country this terrible miseducation system where children of all races don't learn anything about black Americans, which is why they continue the myth that, well, black Americans haven't done much, except these hidden figures that we pull out every now and again, genius. And white Americans did most of the work. Now that we're discovering that's not true, it's impossible to continue to hide that. So the Kerner Commission was, in large part, a PR stunt. It was supposed to be something that really got to the heart of what was wrong with America and what could be fixed. But most of the fixes were left to the local governments that weren't going to fix them because they were implicit in segregation and discrimination. And to the media, which didn't have to do anything because they didn't belong to them. And we still deal with those exact same problems today.
Okay. So I want to piggyback off of two things that our last two panelists said, and then head to one of the other sort of key moments or key elements of this commission. So one, both Dr. Shipp and Ms. Riley talked about, you would bring, black people were brought in, the commission would advise bringing black people in and integrating them into different parts and types of newspapers. But as we all know, and there's a political science term for this, it's called all skin folk ain't kin folk. Just because you bring black people into a newspaper or a television network doesn't mean that they care anything about black people. And in fact, I can speak, and I'm sure everybody on this panel can speak without dropping specific names, of all sorts of black people who end up in front of the camera and writing, who actually disdain black folks. But they're put in those positions because it's a convenient way for a newspaper or a radio station or a magazine to claim that they're actually doing something. The reason this is significant is because, well, the Kerner Commission was a result of trying to assess what the root causes were of uprisings 50 years ago. We've had similar things happening in this country in the last 3 or 4 years. With Ferguson, with Baltimore, with LA, with parts of Cleveland. There have been uprisings in places that we haven't even been hearing about. And in large part because most newspapers and magazines still don't have people who are willing to go to these areas and talk about anything that's going on. So this is key because one of the results or one of the conclusions of the Kerner Commission in the media section was they said that the newspapers oftentimes use scare headlines that were completely at odds with the more moderate content in the story. So what that means is Baltimore burns, and then actually it's about 1 block, right? What it means is Ferguson on fire. I was there. It was 1 street, okay? And so what I'd like to ask the entire panel is, what are your experiences with covering, instances of uprisings or political protests in the black community, and how did your reporting contrast with many of the mainstream messages that you might have seen on television? To give a quick example, I literally remember being in Ferguson during the riots. I was tear gassed, and then going home and watching it on the news. Now, it was dangerous, but it was one small part of a fairly small town. I went home, I watched CNN, I thought it was a No Church in the Wild video. It was ridiculous, right? I mean, it wasn't even close to what was actually happening. So I'm curious if the panel has those kinds of experiences, and if you could share those with the audience.
Well, I enter into the conversation a little bit differently because I'm not a journalist. It is something that I have started to do. I was the editor of my school newspaper, and I remember when I began to cover what was happening with Black Lives Matter. As a historian, I would lock myself in the archives. I studied 19th century black women. I was very happy and felt very safe there, hoping to kind of buy myself out of any racial injustice that my sons might one day encounter. If we lived in the right neighborhood, if we go to the right schools, we can, kind of escape what was happening in this country until Trayvon Martin was killed. And it was a stark realization for many folks like me that you cannot educate yourself out of racism. You can't buy yourself out of racism. It is the reality of what it means to be black in this country, and I couldn't figure out what to do. And so I began to call a lot of my college professors, who many of them are retired. I called Dr. Skip Gates, who's not retired. I'm like, Dr. Skip, what do I do? He said, didn't you once write for a newspaper in college? I'm like, yes. He said, well, then why don't you do that? Why don't you go out and start writing and see if places like the Baltimore Sun and the Afro will take what you're writing about as a black mother who is raising sons in Baltimore City and what is happening around the world will at some point get to where you are now. And that's what led me out to begin covering what was happening Ferguson in Baltimore, thinking about what was happening around the world through the lens of Baltimore, and then of course we got to Freddie Gray. And being out there with my sons, pulling them out, and we were marching and writing every single day and submitting it to any newspaper that would take it. If newspapers rejected my op-eds, I'd put them up on my website. My sons would take them and post them in schools, but it was about our perspective of what it meant to live in Baltimore City, to watch the narrative around Baltimore City get framed, and to realize that the Baltimore they were talking about only existed in certain communities. So when they enacted a curfew in Baltimore, actually going out in the street and doing the hashtag curfew not in my area, and going around to predominantly white and privileged communities saying there is no curfew here. There's only a curfew in certain communities, and why is that? Beginning to investigate food deserts, and that is what really led me to doing the work I do with the Afro and the work I do with Today with Dr. K, wanting to have a voice and bringing my perspective as a black mother raising teen boys in Baltimore City understanding that what happens around the world actually impacts Baltimore even more, that we are a microcosm of America, and seeking to use the outlet. So that is how I enter into kind of my journalistic ways, but coming in as a writer and a mother who's just concerned about wanting to control the narrative so that the narrative doesn't control the future that my sons might have one day.
I remember, I want to add to this, and this will spring into the question for Professor Shipp. You know, I remember being in Ferguson, and when you talk about when people actually live there and are from the community and how that reporting changes. I grew up about 30 minutes from Ferguson when I was a kid, and I remember watching a national news reporter walk around and say, you know, this is such a low class, you know, sad neighborhood, and many of these apartments rent for as little as $450 a month. And I remember thinking, if you're from the Midwest, that's actually pretty normal. $450 a month doesn't mean poor. Now, if you're some reporter that just parachuted in from New York, $450 is what you pay for a parking ticket, right? But that's regular housing. So the role that you can play, not just as someone who may know your own community, but as a black person who knows the community, is really important, even sometimes if we don't know our own neighbors. To Professor Shipp, you know, you were here during Freddie Gray. You've sent out students. What kinds of missions, what were you trying to do when you were teaching classes and assigning students and doing your own coverage of what happened with Freddie Gray here and sort of the revolution in the aftermath?
Well, when I first discovered journalism, I was in high school. I helped to integrate my high school in Georgia. And it was even then that I began to see that white people did not understand or know black people. They thought they did. In the South, many white people had black servants of one type or another, and so they would probably say some of my good friends are black. But they didn't know black people. So I realized that even then. When I got to college, it became even more noticeable, the gap between how we lived and how people in media thought we lived when they thought about it at all. So years later, it was very clear that when we have an uprising such as what happened after the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, the primary interests of media seemed to be on how much property damage was being done, how much people were being inconvenienced, and by people, generally you mean white people, commuters, business people, how much they're being inconvenienced, what the likelihood of this activity spreading to some other parts of the city are. And so it was never really about who the real people were who were being harmed, either by the police, and oftentimes it's something precipitated by police, or who were being harmed in the communities during these uprisings. There was not much interest in what led to the disturbances, who the people were, how they lived, and so everything was kind of superficial. In Baltimore, the big focus seemed to have been that CVS shop burning. You all know what I'm talking about. Every scene seemed to be that. And yet we know that much of the rest of even that part of Baltimore was not really engaged in that. It was not all that much fire, looting, etc., right? But it was always that. You didn't see the people behind the scenes who were doing what they could to either bring the peace or to come to the assistance of people who were being inconvenienced. For example, some of the elderly who couldn't get their medicines from the pharmacies. There was a whole brigade of people doing all kinds of things to bring the community back together, and that was missed altogether. So when we in the journalism school were sending students out, it was to find the stories that go beyond what we were seeing on television, to go beyond the CVS burning, and to find out what real people were thinking and what they wanted to do to fix the community. That's the other thing. Oftentimes when you talk about how do we solve the problems, it starts with the mayor and the police commissioner and maybe a city council member or two. But again, you never really get to the real people to talk to them. So in our sending people out, it was with that in mind.
That's an excellent point. I want to jump straight to this because one of the second recommendations from the Kerner Commission in the media section was to expand the sources upon which are used to report about the black community. That all too often it is the very same government officials who are perpetuating and maintaining these systems of oppression are the first people they go talk to. So they go talk to the police chief who may or may not have done anything. They go talk to the head of city council or something else like that, who may or may not know. And one other thing I think is key, and I'm sure Ms. Riley's going to speak about this extensively, it even requires, even when you have reporters who understand, well, maybe I won't just ask the police chief what he thinks. Black people exist in more places than churches and barbershops. Mm-hmm. I know this is shocking, but it's true. There are other places to get African-American sources other than barbershops and churches. And so the sourcing about the black community is also one of the great weaknesses that the Kerner Commission talked about, even if they didn't realize how much they were bringing out to the fore.
Well, I can tell you two things. One is because I'm a newspaper columnist, I determine what I write about. We would not have had coverage from Baltimore if I had not volunteered to go. And I volunteered to go because at the time, we only had 2 editors at the Detroit Free Press of color, that are black. And one of them is my sorority sister, who said, okay, you gotta go to Baltimore. You gotta do Freddie Gray, because if not, we're not gonna have our own coverage. And I said, of course. And literally, my job, as you learn, all of us learn, whether we're in J school for print or for broadcast, is you've got to find out who, what, when, where, and sometimes why. I skipped all the who, what, when, and where. I didn't need any of that. I came to do the why and what's next. Mm-hmm. So I spent all of my time in the streets, at the high school. I didn't need to go to the CVS. I'd seen it every day. That was not where I needed to be. I met some of the most amazing people in places. Literally, you cannot say, okay, go to Baltimore and go to this spot. You have to be out there talking to people about where they are, where people are gathered to have a discussion, or where people are talking about what happened, or to talk to family members or members of the circle of the family who people don't go talk to because, number one, they don't know them, number two, they don't care enough to go find them. The thing that I remember, because when you mentioned Jason Blair, and you mentioned starting in, I think you said 70. Mm-hmm. I graduated from journalism school in '81, and I remember that was my first year as a professional journalist, and a woman named Janet Cook made up a story and ruined our lives for the next 5 years.
At least 5.
At least 5. Because every single time you did anything as a black journalist, you were questioned, you were double-checked. I got less of that because I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I was the only member of my family not to attend an HBCU, and it broke my heart, but I wanted to go to the best journalism school. So I got a pass. I still got to do stories. I didn't get that same treatment. I watched my black colleagues literally sit while an editor would call someone they talked to make sure they talked to them, and I thought they should sue. So when we talk about who does the stories and how the stories get done, you have to pay attention not just to the black journalists that they'll have on staff so they can say, well, we've got a poster up on the wall showing our black folks, which doesn't mean anything if they're sitting at a desk writing obits or never get to go out on a major story. But it's those other people who usually Bigfoot everybody else. That's a term we used to use at the Washington Post when one of the big reporters would come in and take over a story that you might have started because, it's Bob Woodward or it's Tom Sherwood or whoever it is. If you don't train them, if you don't school them, if you don't remind them, well, don't go all the way to Baltimore and go sit in the police chief's office and then send some wonderfully written narrative that has nothing to do with real life. That changed a little bit, but not that much. People still do that. You will still see stories. You're going to see stories about the pipe bombs for the next 2 weeks that will have nothing to do with the fear of people who had to handle them, the people in the neighborhoods around them. There are folks who, if this plot had happened, could have been killed, who will never be in any news story on CNN, but who are scared to death about what's happening because this is going to continue. They found Cory Booker's, this morning. So at some point, it's not going to be because of the Kerner Commission report, because as I said, that was an exercise in trying to show that they were doing something. It was a circus act. What you have to do is figure out who's going to step up and say, we really have to change things. And that means we have to start talking to real people, because it was real people in Detroit and real people in Los Angeles and real people everywhere there was an uprising who said enough. And we're expecting any day now that there will be, some place where folks have been tired of what's continuing to go on and will say enough is enough. And I will put this little last caveat on. We just did all of this major coverage of 50 years since the uprising in Detroit. And the person who wrote the big narrative for our paper was a good reporter named Bill McGraw, a middle-aged white guy who is from Detroit, and they felt could give this some great heft and some good. And his story started with a black guy throwing a bottle. That was not the cause of the Detroit uprising. But every time they tell that story, it makes it easier for white readers and white viewers and white listeners to put some type of time and place on this instead of 70 years of discrimination and police brutality and housing segregation, and nobody could get a loan to do anything, so now all the people who own these buildings that are now being sold in Detroit are white. There were real reasons that people were upset. There were real reasons that frustration and anger boiled over, and it was not that some guy threw a bottle at a cop.
I think it's important just to add, before we go to the next question, that we have to talk about the advent of the internet and social media and how it democratizes news. So even though we have our journalists going in and telling the story, you can go online and you can find different narratives. One of the things that I really appreciated about the Baltimore uprising is I didn't have to go to the Baltimore Sun to get the news. I can go to people in the community who were posting out on Twitter, on their Facebook, who were on the ground. And I know that Kerner 50 years ago didn't have that other resource, but to be able to tap into what's happening in Ferguson, not from a news reporter, not from a journalist, but from the person living on that block, to show us it's not just the entire Ferguson, it's one block. We cannot underestimate the power of citizen journalism in a different way of reporting the news and sharing the news. I mean, that's what's driving a lot of conversations today. How do you know about the number of black people who are unarmed and been killed? Somebody's videotaping that and sharing it. Now, we can talk about how that's impacting us in terms of our psyche, but it is getting the news out in a different way. People aren't waiting for the newspaper. They're actually putting the news out on a regular, ongoing basis now.
Let me just add one little thing though, because this is important since I work for a newspaper. We have really got to make people be honest.
Yes.
That means you do not have to accept what comes from even the mainstream news sources that you used to trust if they're not doing what you want. Now that we have the immediacy of the internet, we can hold news outlets accountable in a way that was never possible before. You can't always trust everything you get on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. So find the ones who are legitimate and share those and make sure you're letting people know this person knows what they're talking about. But if your news source, whether it's the Baltimore Sun or the Detroit Free Press, is not giving you what you know is true, hold them accountable, make them better. The Kerner Commission is not going to do it, but we can all do it. We now have true citizen power to make people stand up and do the right thing or be driven into oblivion.
I think a key thing here, we're about to sort of go to the audience for questions, and the internet is sort of a perfect way to get there. This idea of sort of democratizing not only journalism, but how we discuss journalism. Throughout this entire panel, and this isn't from me, it's because all of these brilliant people up here know better, we have used the words revolution, we have used the words uprising. No one's saying race riot. All throughout my college education, these were all race riots. The LA riots, right? The Baltimore, as a matter of fact, if you step out of Baltimore, you're going to hear Baltimore riots. It's very important that everybody recognize and understand, all of you journalism students, that the words you use have power. And you are in a position for one of the first times in your life to control the narratives that go out there. When something is trending on Twitter, the newspapers pay attention to it. Television will pay attention to it, whether that's regionally or nationally. They'll say, okay, if that's how this is being discussed. And I'll give you a quick example of this, and we'll go to the audience. I specifically remember the assassinations at Mother Emanuel Church. And again, it's an assassination. Those weren't shootings, that was an assassination. And I remember collectively having conversations with other African-American journalists and people on site who were both personally and politically affected to say this was a white nationalist assassination. And we all fought to make sure that that was the discussion. We refused to allow any reporters or journalists or anchors or editors to just call it a shooting, because it wasn't. And that's part of what you all are going to be responsible for doing. The Kerner Commission never imagined, because they didn't want black people to have this kind of power. The Kerner Commission never imagined a generation of people who, with the use, assuming that you're paid up, of your phone, can dominate public discussion and discourse. So with that in mind, before I go to the next question, I wanted to make sure that we got to some questions in the audience. You have questions about reporting, you have questions about how you cover sort of extensive things. There is a microphone right over there, so all of you can step to the mic. Anyone who wants to volunteer, feel free to do so. Be brave. There's cookies involved. You can do it. All right. Well, you get your cookies later. So what I want to ask about that is, what does social media do to, or how would you, how do you think the Kerner Commission would respond to the idea of social media, right? All of their discussions about, how media should change. They, of course, never envisioned citizen journalism the way that we can engage in it now. They never envisioned something like Black Twitter. They never envisioned dozens upon dozens of African Americans at the local level beginning as activists, transforming into citizen journalists, and then getting hired at reputable news sources. How do you think the internet has changed what their suggestions were, what their complaints were 50 years ago?
Well, for one thing, I think they might not have envisioned this, but the notion that we need a diversity of voices is definitely what we're seeing through the advent of social media. It's also a way that mainstream media can begin to diversify its sources. That was another one of those suggestions. Sometimes you will find that mainstream media editors and reporters will turn to social media not only to find out what's going on, but to begin to determine who are some of the people they can call upon as sources for the future. So I think that's something that, while not anticipated, it is bringing us closer to what was being recommended in 1968.
And it's shaking up, oh, go ahead.
I think they would also be shocked into silence by how quickly they could be criticized. I mean, can you imagine Lyndon Johnson giving that speech now as we are tweeting during it? How condescending.
Oh,
Why
he'd
is
be
he
mean.
saying that? How dare he? All of that would be immediate when there was a time where not only would they get away with it, there would be criticism the next day or even, decades later, we just get to the point where people are talking about not just the report, but the officials who demanded the report and thought they'd done something great, like they're patting themselves on the back. Can we still talk about the Kerner Commission report as if it's this reputable, wonderful thing where people are trying, when nobody's doing anything really? I mean, not really. Now, I don't want to dismiss some of the efforts that were made. Les Payne, in that piece that he wrote about the Kerner Commission report, cited Newsday as an exception to the rule because that Long Island newspaper hired a bunch of black folks, including him, and he was a longtime editor, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and wrote a column. But that wasn't every place. I remember literally being in my very first newspaper, the Greensboro Daily News in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I could count the number of black people on one hand, and 3 of them worked in features. And the other 2 were a woman from New York who experienced what I was talking about before, where once Janet Cook made a story up, they checked out everything she did, and me. And they weren't quite sure what to do with me because they thought I was one of the smart blacks. Oh, she went to Carolina, so, we can give her a better story. And of course, they were shocked when they realized, as I made clear to them, that I was still black.
So let me ask you this real quick, just for the audience, could you briefly tell them the Janet Cook story, because a lot of them may not know that story.
Of course. There are very few places as prestigious to work if you're a newspaper reporter than the New York Times and the Washington Post. And Janet Cook was this very gorgeous woman from Ohio. She was from Sandusky, Ohio. She got hired, and they loved her. They loved everything she did. She was actually a great writer, great narrative, could do things. So she decided that she was going to do a story where she would find out just how bad the drug situation was in Washington. And she went in search of a family so she could find some impact on a family. And she came back and said she found a family where the little boy in the family, who she called Jimmy, was hooked on drugs. He helped his mom, when she was doing whatever she was doing. He would shoot up, just this horrific story. It was the most amazing story of the year about this, I think it was an 8-year-old boy named Jimmy.
In Washington, D.C.
And it won the Pulitzer Prize. And after it won the Pulitzer Prize, the Washington Post learned that the story was entirely made up. There was nothing about it that was true. But such was the pressure on this woman that she decided that she had to live up to this reputation that she was getting at the Washington Post, and took it a step further and created a story that was what they would want. And they took the Pulitzer back. The last I heard years ago, she was working at a department store in Ohio somewhere. I don't know where she is now. But once that happened, not just at the Washington Post, but at newspapers, I can't speak for television stations or radio stations, but at newspapers across the country, black reporters felt the brunt of that the way, I guess a decade, 12 years later, they felt when Jason Blair, who was a New York Times reporter, who was sitting in his apartment making up stories about other stuff, it happened again where, oh my God, we couldn't trust this guy. Now we have to really look closely at black reporters. It was very unfair. It was very unfortunate. But it made clear this is how easy it was for white editors to find a reason not to trust black reporters.
I think that shows the difference. I remember the Janet Cook story. I'm from Washington, D.C. My dad's a pastor. There were pastors using that and preaching from the pulpit about what our responsibility was to the black community. How could we let Jimmy suffer like this, that there are Jimmys all over our city, and we would do weekend activities. No one ever checked to find Jimmy. We just assumed it was a true story. It was in the Washington Post. It was a true story, and who was Jimmy and how could we help him? If you just fast forward to today, that to me is why social media is so frightening and so good. Because now if you're gonna tell me Jimmy is out there shooting jokes, I want a picture of Jimmy, I need to check your phone, where were you, what's happening? It's taken the power out of people who consider themselves to own the access of power. It is putting the power into young people, into citizens, into communities. That's what's so frightening for people about social media. They've been holding on to power because I have this job, I've been doing it for 20 years, I have all these degrees, I'm the expert. Well, no, I live here. I'm now the expert.
Literally, particularly Twitter, which is why I love Twitter.
I love
also
Twitter.
Donald Trump loves Twitter. I really do.
Yes.
And the moment that story would be, it wouldn't have just waited to be printed in the paper.
No.
The moment that story was posted, there would be people questioning and asking things even then. Well, wait a minute, you said Jimmy lives on this, I live in that building.
I've never
I
seen
don't know
Jimmy,
that.
yes.
There's no 8-year-old in that particular,
Yes.
on that particular floor. Instantaneously, people would have seen it was a lie. So you talk about being all over you cannot, nobody could get away with that type of story now with social media.
But even with mainstream media, they might not get away with it because there are more black voices who would be spotting this and asking more questions. And there were some black editors involved with the Jimmy story, but that was a whole different other circumstance. Now there will be many more voices there spotting this and challenge.
And I want to add to that. And are you
The
all
student-
lined
are they
up to
waiting
ask
in line?
questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh,
I want
okay.
to make sure we get to, you were a bit far away, so yes, you can start.
Come on down, yes.
And remember, please, since we're relatively short, so about 7 minutes, so make sure it's a very succinct question and try and aim it towards one particular panel so we can get to as many as possible.
Just ask your question.
Try. One of us will
Lay it
answer.
on us.
Go ahead.
My name is Gregory Allen, senior multi-platform production major, and I just wanted to ask, out of all the social media platforms, what would you say is the most valuable?
Twitter.
Twitter?
If the president is on Twitter, you need to be on Twitter. And if there's something that you can find out or share immediately and it's true, that's the best way to do it. Facebook has become a very strange platform right now. Instagram is really just for celebrity photos. I mean, your celebrity photos, all types of celebrities, major, minor, whatever. But Twitter is an actual tool.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And your outfits are amazing, by the way.
Oh.
See y'all soon.
Thank you, yes.
Question?
Hi, how are you doing? My name is Brittany Johnson. I'm a journalism student here. My question is for you. I'm not sure what your name is, ma'am, right here.
Miss Riley.
Rochelle Riley. Rochelle Riley.
Okay. Ms. Riley, my question is for you. You talked a lot about how some of your colleagues experienced racism at the workplace by having that work double-checked and sources double-checked and things like that. Do you feel as though it's because they went to HBCUs, or do you feel that if black people went to more PWIs, predominantly white institutions, that they would have a better chance at like being respected in the journalism field?
It's a good question, and you have to remember this was 30 years ago, but because they were black, and had I not gone to Carolina, and Carolina was a school that these editors loved, I probably would have had the same problem. But going to an HBCU does make a difference, and that's why it's so important for us to make sure people know how great our HBCUs are. What they're doing at this School of Global Journalism is outstanding, which is why even though I'm on book deadline, when Dean Wickham said, come do this, I went, what time do I need to be there? But we do have to make sure that people understand what Betsy DeVos, Education Secretary from Michigan, what she doesn't understand. HBCUs were not a choice.
Right.
HBCUs were necessary because students could not get into some of the schools where people did not want us. So there will always be some type of bias, but you have to rise above that no matter what.
In your response, I appreciate your response, but in your response you mentioned it makes a difference. How do HBCUs make a difference, and what kind of difference do they make?
Well, if I had gone to an HBCU, I would have had a much better time outside of journalism school than I would have in journalism. Journalism school for me was my entire career at Carolina, because the rest of it was racism in other classes. Being a part of 3% of black people on a campus where people looked at you like, why are you here?
Right.
I like a campus that nurtures people and makes sure that you get everything that you need.
Right.
And that's something that HBCUs do for students who don't always get that someplace else. I'm not saying don't go to a predominantly white university. Don't tell anybody I said that. Don't tell anybody I said that in our other 4 schools. I'm just saying that there are things that you can get when you are being trained by people who care about you that you don't always get someplace else.
I went to an HBCU, and I just want to back that up. I went to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, and I often tell people, out of all 4 of the institutions I received, with all the degrees that I have, my HBCU was holy ground for me, because I went to a place where I never had to think about being the other. I never had to have my words questioned every time I spoke in the classroom. I never had a fear that I would be lost in the crowd. I never had to question, am I here just because they're filling a quota? Every time I walked on the campus and I saw everyone from the president to the person working on the grounds looked like me, and it just leveled the playing field.
Well, I did not go to an HBCU, and I came to Morgan in part because of that. But I learned early on to speak up and speak out, because I was that rare voice that white people would see, but also could be a voice to help other black people understand their place. So I've been doing that no matter where.
And I want to add to that, because we're going to have to probably wrap up in a minute. Not only is everything every panelist said absolutely true, particularly jumping off of what Ms. Riley said. Yeah, so my doctorate is out of Chapel Hill. Racist people don't care. they don't care. They don't care what kind of school you went to. People are going to behave the way that they're going to behave. I always sort of give this example whenever HBCU students are concerned about how we're viewed or whether our work will be seen. Back when black people were slaves and we worked every single day until we died, white folks would hold scientific conferences about how lazy we were. What we actually do in reality has no bearing on what occurs in the white imagination. What's important for you is to get whatever education you can out of any institution that you happen to be in and use it to the best of your ability. The particular strength that you will get at an HBCU, and I can say that as somebody who was taught at multiple HBCUs with my PWI education, is simply this. You will be in an environment where, under the best circumstances, because there's good schools and bad schools of all kinds, but under the best circumstances, you will have people that will tell you the truth. You will have people who will tell you how to be the best in your profession under all circumstances. You will not suffer through the benign neglect of having some condescending white person who's liberal find you to be the special one and not give you the kind of work, feedback, and challenge that you need to be the best that you can be. That is actually the greatest struggle that we face when we go to predominantly white institutions. So that's always something important for all students to remember. With that in mind, we are pretty close to the end of our program. I know we have a hard out at 12. First and foremost, I want you guys to give a huge round of applause to our fantastic panelists. And a couple other things I just want to say at the end. I think it's extremely important. I know some of you guys are here at these panels because it's for extra credit, which is great. All my students are going to get extra credit, ones who are here. But this is also a really, really good learning opportunity. You guys are in a school of journalism. Look up Janet Cook. Look up Jason Blair. Watch the movie Shattered Glass about Stephen Glass, which I've shown in my classes. There are so many things about how journalism works and so many great journalism films out there and references that this panel has made that I hope you guys will carry with you once you leave this room. I strongly encourage all of you to watch the rest of the programming that's going to start. We have a short film that's going to happen around 12 that you can watch online, and then we're going to kind of hand off the baton to a next institution. There are also opportunities for you guys to discuss things with these panelists here. They've got books.
And my
They've got books
students are
that
here.
are coming. They've got
Yes.
books with them now that you guys should purchase.
Yes.
Thank you all so very much for your time, and we will see you again soon.
In looking back over the past 50 years since the Kerner report was published, what my research tells me that many people found interesting is how often it is still invoked after 50 years, and how it is often still quoted verbatim. I think that, especially given that it is not readily possible to remember any wording whatsoever from other historically significant commission reports, such as Warren or the 9/11 report, it is definitely worth having this conversation today. And today we have three esteemed panelists here to have a poignant conversation about diversity in the newsroom 50 years after Kerner. They will discuss and answer questions about the changes in the definition of and how we talk about diversity and what intentional changes have been made since Kerner was written. The overriding question, of course, is why are we still facing the same challenges 50 years later, and why is there still such a lack of diversity in the newsrooms? Dr. Beeson gave you a brief overview of the credentials of our panelists, but I've been given the charge of reading their bios for you. So we'll start with Dr. Meredith Clark. She is an assistant professor in the Media Studies Department at the University of Virginia. Her experience as a newspaper journalist influences her research, which focuses on the intersections of race, media, and power. She was named number 66 on the Route 100, the news website's list of the most influential African Americans in the country in 2015. She was a founding contributor to Pointers.org's diversity column, and her research has been published in Journalism and Mass Communication Educator, the Journal of Social Media in Society, and New Media and Society. Clark is a graduate of Florida A&M University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is currently the primary investigator for the American Society of News Editors Annual Newsroom Diversity Survey. Thank you, Dr. Clark, for being here. Dr. Cynthia R. Greenlee is an editor, writer, and historian based in North Carolina. She is currently the senior editor at Rewire News. She has started her journalism career at one of the first 24-hour online news sites and has worked in newspapers on copy and features desks, and then in communications as an editor for several international health organizations and national nonprofits. Her writing has appeared in Smithsonian, The Washington Post, Long Reads, Elle, Bon Appetit, National Public Radio, and more. Dr. Greenlee earned a master's in journalism from the University of North Carolina and a PhD in history from Duke University, where she specialized in the history of gender and Black girlhood in the 19th century South. She is a member of the Echoing Ida collective of Black women and non-binary people who write about reproductive and social justice. And she is one of the co-editors of the forthcoming Echoing anthology. Welcome, Dr. Greenlee. And last but not least, Dr. Michelle Ferrier is the founder of TrollBusters.com, a just-in-time rescue service for women writers and journalists experiencing online harassment. She is a digital content architect with 30 years experience in media entrepreneurship and new media technologies. Ferrier is an associate professor in the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism at Ohio University and was named one of the top 20 journalism innovation educators for 2018. Ferrier is an award-winning columnist and author. She is featured in the Committee to Protect Journalists 2016 edition of Attacks on the Press, where she wrote Progression of Hate, a chapter that tells her own story of hate, hate mail attacks, and the birth of TrollBusters.com as a solution to new forms of harassment. Ferrier has presented before the United Nations on World Press Freedom Day, as a keynote speaker at the Online News Association, and as a panelist at the News Impact Summit hosted by the European Journalism Center on the growing dangers for women journalists online. She is also the former president of Journalism That Matters and the creator of the Create or Die series of startup gatherings for media innovation in underserved and underrepresented communities. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Ferrier. I'll now turn to our panelists for their insights, and then I'll come with some prepared questions and be also ready for questions from the audience. I'd like for each of you to just give us an overview of why you're here and what you're going to share with us today. Who would like to start? Okay.
Sure. So as was mentioned, I am the principal investigator for the American Society of News Editors annual Newsroom Diversity Survey. The survey was born 10 years after the Kerner Commission report was released, so it's celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. As a tool, the survey is designed to encourage transparency in news organizations about who is on staff and the communities that they represent. The survey was a tool of the American Society of News Editors as it worked to encourage parity between the newsrooms and the communities that they served. It had an initial goal in 2000 of achieving actual racial parity and gender parity with the communities that the newsrooms who reported in were serving. As we grew closer to 2000, the organization realized it would not make that goal, and it set another goal. We are at a point now where we are reflecting on the utility of the survey, the demands that technology has placed for changes to the survey, and also whether the survey has perhaps reached a point that it needs to undergo transformation in order to better reflect the changes that the newsroom has experienced. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about my experience in running the survey, some of the things that the data have told us already, and some of the things that we are still collecting data on to give more context to the numbers.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cynthia Greenlee. I am the senior editor at Rewire.News. We are a social justice publication. We're also a nonprofit media organization, and that's one of the things I want to talk about while I'm here today. But I think it's also important for me to give a little bit of a demographic about like what our newsroom looks like, and we can use that as a jumping off point. So I work in a small newsroom. We're a media publication that has 40 employees all over the country. We work remotely, which is an experience that many of you who are students will probably have at some point in your career. And we have 6 editors. I'm including copy editors because copy editors are editors too. So of our 6 editors, 2 of us are African American, 1 of us is queer, 1 of us is Latino, 1 of us is rural, and we look like a lot of newsrooms don't in the United States, to put it mildly. And so to think about my career in context, I started at a very small Black newspaper in the South that was started by Black nationalists in the wake of the Kerner report. And I also then went to online news. I've worked at newspapers that were small and large. I've worked online only. I also freelance. So I have a lot of different ideas about what inclusion means in each one of these places. And I think I'm the only assigning editor on this panel who works 9 to 5 in journalism. And so that means that I have to think about what diversity actually means for my coverage and thinking broader. And my definition of diversity continues to be broadened in terms of making sure that we think about region as well as race, thinking about the ways in which Blackness is not one thing, and thinking about how whiteness is not one thing. Also thinking about the ways in which I work with journalists who have disabilities that in some way affect the way they work. So for instance, I may work with journalists who have issues where they don't type. I can think of one case where that's happened. So my diversity is a pretty big catch-all, and I think yours should be too.
Great. My name is Michelle Ferrier again, and I'm the current dean at the School of Journalism and Graphic Communications at Florida A&M University. My background, though, is in both on the representation side. My master's was in looking at the representations of people of color in the media and how rural communities and children in rural communities perceived people of color based on those representations. Since that time, have developed the work specifically in looking at solutions outside of the newsroom. Since the Kerner Commission, the focus, both through the ASNE survey as well as activity, has been about, as I say, putting warm bodies in the newsroom to achieve that parity that mirrors the geographic space that they're operating in. Having come from the newsroom, now working in higher ed, I see that 50 years later, there's very little progress in the space that we're talking about, and that it's not just about recruiting people into the newsroom, but retaining them. And through my own experiences as a journalist and as an educator, I have seen time and time again the doors closed, people shoved out of the profession because of their race, their color, and other things. What that means in terms of the voices that we have in our current newsrooms is very limited in being able to share the experiences of Appalachia, from where I've most recently come, to the communities and really coverage of the types of violence that Black people across the U.S. are experiencing now. And so when I look at the work that I have been called to do, it is to help equip our students with the innovation and entrepreneurship skills to be able to create pathways, to create formats, to create delivery systems, to create companies that can distribute representative content, get the stories of underserved and underrepresented communities out to the public, like the 100 Days in Appalachia project here has done, to try and lift up the assets of the region and provide a communication channel for the voices of our people, but ultimately to look beyond our newsrooms, especially in communities like ours, which many of whom lack newspapers, lack media organizations. And so here in the heart of America, where we lack news organizations, it's not about warm bodies, it's about how do we create communications that brings people together. And that's the work that I'll be talking about today.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to kind of segue off of your statement there and ask, can you define the term media desert for us and talk a little about what can be done structurally to help facilitate getting news to underserved communities?
Sure. I use the term media desert, which I defined as a larger entity that looks at multiple layers of the communications infrastructure. We're talking about the code layer, the content layer, and the conduit layers, to use a framework by Lawrence Lessig, that looks at the multiple and complex ways in which information is created and distributed in today's digital world. And what we find is that media deserts, normally what we've heard in recent research is a focus on news deserts, which only focuses on the content layer of the model that I look at. It's our people getting content that's representative of the community. And that really is what News Deserts is looking at in terms of doing a content analysis and looking at the kinds of stories that are told, how those stories are told, who's represented in the sources of those stories, et cetera. However, News Deserts doesn't explain the kinds of situations that we see here in Appalachia, in Southeast Ohio, and other communities that have never had news outlets, good daily news, fresh news and information. And when we look at areas that lack broadband access, on the professional side, we have our organizations pushing to mobile, and yet where I was in Southeast Ohio, 10 minutes from our school, we had no cell phone coverage. And so how can we expect our rural communities to have a diverse diet that includes diverse voices when they are limited to the diet of perhaps radio and markets that are pretty much locked up by conservative media voices in our rural areas? And so they lack the distribution points to be able to even get good content out to the people that need to hear it. And so our work, my work and research is really in those innovation spaces. How can we design new tools, new people, new skill sets, et cetera, to help us engage communities that don't have information, and then also to look at the code layer, the content and conduit layers. As I said, even if you create the content, do you have the distribution channels to get it out? And the work that I do in Trollbusters is very much about even journalists that do have a voice and a platform being under attack by concerted forces designed to shut down and silence the media organizations. And so we're looking at creating ways that we can create voice for ourselves outside of the newsroom.
Okay. This question is for all of you. Can you tell us what does it mean to be a journalist of color in a moment when journalists and the First Amendment are being publicly attacked, literally and institutionally at every turn. And I think with this panel also, what does it mean to be a woman of color during this time?
I guess I'll start that one.
Sips tea.
So let me say this. So the publication I work for focuses on reproductive health, rights, and justice, which means we do a lot of reporting about topics that are highly politicized and polarizing, and also we do a lot of specialized health reporting. And so, you know, you can't talk about our work without talking about abortion. And so what that means is that we've always been under fire in terms of the content we offer. For me specifically, being a woman of color who is also a journalist, it means that I have been the only one in many spaces. We just talked about being at the same journalism school, and I shared how I was the only African-American student in my graduate school cohort, and that certainly hasn't changed. That's been the same no matter where I've gone in terms of my education, whether it was my history PhD program or my journalism master's program. And I will say that I am known in conservative and anti-abortion circles as Black Abortion Girl. And so I routinely get all sorts of hate mail to my personal Twitter account. You know, we certainly receive hate mail relatively frequently at our job site. And those things are connected. Like, certainly I am a more obvious target in many ways, because also my scholarly research is partially about reproductive health. So I have a forthcoming book about African Americans and abortion. So you can just imagine what that looks like. And, you know, newsrooms, and I don't work in a traditional newsroom. I work at home in my office. I'm connected to all my coworkers through an online network that we have. But I think that newsrooms have been slow to actually acknowledge the very real security issues that we as journalists face. So, and I don't think, you know, I'm saying anything that my supervisors would hate by saying we have been slow to do that, to think about when we send reporters out to Capitol Hill. We also have the only known trans Capitol Hill reporter in the country working for us. And so when we send reporters to Capitol Hill, like, what happens when they meet people face to face who are anti-abortion people, who want to get them on camera, who want to bum rush them and get them to say something in a moment of stress and conflict? And so that's something that we've dealt with every day before, you know, the current political climate in which journalists are definitely under fire in different ways. We also, as a nonprofit and smaller media organization, find that it's sometimes hard for us to get credentials to go places because we do social justice journalism. And so what that means is that we do sometimes have a point of view. That doesn't mean we're not objective, but it means we have a stance. And one of those things is that we believe that everyone has the right to have comprehensive health care, whether that is contraception, whether that's abortion, whether that's free STI testing, any of those things. And so, you know, we are existing at Rewire.News in an atmosphere which we've always existed in since we were founded about a decade ago. And I, as a woman of color, we also have a Black woman managing editor. So half of our senior level editorial staff is Black women, which is unusual. And that sets us apart in a lot of different ways, for better or for worse.
Having left the newsroom about 4 years ago now, and that was my second time leaving the newsroom, I look at the current landscape and the current conditions in which journalists find themselves working as being conditions in which being a woman of color and being a journalist of color, that experience now becomes legible for everyone. That the experience of being harassed because of who you are and what you do has now become something that more people are familiar with, because journalism as a whole has been thrown into a debate, into a frenzy around sensational terms. And so as I watch journalists talk about what they encounter every single day, the hate mail, the calls that they get, the fear for their safety when they go out into the field, I'm sympathetic, because I do remember when I was working in newsrooms that the conditions were exactly the same. But now individuals who otherwise could have passed, could have just gone in being a white male, gone in being a white woman, gone in being whomever they were, and not experience the same kind of prejudicial treatment, are being exposed to that. And they see what it's like. They see what it's like for some of their other colleagues from different spaces. I think that at this time, in the same way that we have dealt with difficulty establishing credibility in communities of color, we're seeing that that difficulty is extending to larger communities, and now it's becoming a problem for more people. So I see it as making those same experiences very legible and very real for people who otherwise enjoyed privileges that did not introduce them to those sort of dangers.
Um,
I'm sorry, Dr. Ferrier has been kind enough to join us this afternoon, but has to catch a flight.
I will. I'm going to finish this last thought if I can. Thank you. That's okay. And then I will dash out. So my apologies. It has been a tough day, and thank you for the reminder. Just recently, 3 weeks ago, I released a brand new report that I wrote in conjunction with the International Women's Media Foundation. It was an international study of journalists across the world in the online as well as physical violence that we've experienced. When Trollbusters was started 4 years ago, most of the work I did was overseas in repressive regimes, whether it was in Russia or the Ukraine or other European Union countries. Sadly, much of my work now is here in the U.S. as we have seen that ratcheting up of the rhetoric in our national scene that has crossed this divisiveness across the web. As we look at this kind of situation, and you talk about the intersectionality of our work, everybody has gotten trolled. Everyone has experienced it, whether it's the public, whether it's journalists or not. And so Meredith's comments, Dr. Clark's comments about that others are now recognizing the kinds of space that journalists of color have lived in for years, they're now coming to experience that. However, from my perspective, in looking at online harassment and the violence that's perpetrated, what we see is there's a very different way in which male journalists, white male journalists, and others are treated online versus women, journalists of color, LGBTQIA journalists, and others who are operating online, those that have visible identities online that can be called out, are often targeted. And our own government at this time is in the process. They have an RFP out to collect the names, social handles, and information on every single journalist that works here in the U.S. If you're not afraid of what's happening in our country right now, you should be. Because if they come after the journalists and we are not able to tell our stories or to be free in telling our stories or are silenced behind the scenes for fear for our lives, then you all are not getting the information you need to make good decisions, whether it's at the polls or in your own life. And so my message today is that we cannot rely on our news organizations to provide and open a door for us. Broadcasting as an industry was much more open to it because there were accountability mechanisms put in place if they didn't diversify their staffs. Newspapers and newsroom and the print side of our business has been very slow without that kind of club to even participate in the surveys to get some transparency into what's happening in the newsrooms. I know what it was like to work in the newsroom, and I don't think anyone should have to be afraid of not being at work for fear of what's going to get in the newspaper, and then being at work and being under attack both inside the newsroom and outside the newsroom by your audiences. And it's critical that we understand that the dynamics of today's digital environment, we are all under attack, and that our media organizations and our schools of higher education need to train our students to be able to operate in these very difficult spaces. So thank you very much for having me here today. Very much appreciate being here and would welcome any follow-up with me on my social channels or otherwise. But I'm leaving you in very, very capable hands. So thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We're going to take a pause for just a second to adjust our panel, and then we're going to jump back into the conversation. And I believe, will there also be some opportunity opportunity for audience questions?
As a matter of fact, yes.
And I'm going to grab this microphone
Okay.
so that we can do that.
I'm the director of the Center for Black Culture and Research here at WVU, and we have with us Dr. Greenlee and Dr. Clark, who are going to continue the discussion. Dr. Ferrier had to leave us as she had another obligation. Before we move to audience questions, we are going to revisit the last question that I asked, which was, what does it mean to be a journalist of color in a moment when journalists and the First Amendment are being publicly attacked literally and institutionally at every turn? And Dr. Greenlee had a follow-up that she would like to give to that question.
So my follow-up is partially general. I wanted to say something as like the working journalist on the panel, that being a woman of color journalist means in various newsrooms I've worked in, it means that I pay a certain cultural tax, which means that whenever we had a community event, I'm not speaking in my current position, just because my editors are watching, but I would always be the one to do the community work. And it was because we wanted to have an idea in the community that our newsroom was more diverse than it actually was. So I often found myself in positions where I was out in a community talking about a reporter's work, which was actually not someone's work I had edited, because we wanted people not to know that our newsroom and all the other editors except me were white men. And so that's challenging, and it's also challenging in the room where you're making decisions about your daily or weekly or monthly content, because people's life experiences do absolutely matter. And thinking even beyond that, like being a reporter in the field, I recently had done some on-the-ground reporting for one of my reporters who was not in the area when my city, Durham, North Carolina, the Confederate statue was toppled by activists, young activists. And I stepped out of my car in front of the courthouse, and I was instantly followed by a man who made very clear his white supremacist tendencies. And I lived in a space where we could not avoid encountering people who, you know, actively wished me harm in that moment. And so there are also considerations about being a woman journalist, being a journalist of color, which means that there are actual physical spaces that are difficult for me to be in. Now, I very rarely report. I do reporting for some of my own freelance work, but that's one of the realities of that job, and that reality has become even more heightened. So beyond the general, I'm a woman reporter and I'm going out to someplace to meet someone to interview them, and I don't know who they are, there's the added stress of knowing that we live in a moment when journalists are being vilified and people don't trust the fourth estate the way we think they used to.
Disturbing to even hear that. We have one more question that I would like to ask Dr. Clark, and then we'll be turning the microphone over to our audience for questions. I heard the panel discussing this earlier during a meeting, and as I heard you talking about the fact that there's a lack of responsiveness by newsrooms as far as collecting and submitting diversity data and doing it effectively. So I'd like to know, what impact does that have on newsroom diversity?
Well, it makes the situation and the context in which we find our newsrooms, it makes it completely opaque. If we don't have newsrooms volunteering the data of their staffing, the racial representation that's there, the gender representation that's there, we are asking LGBTQIA identifying journalists to identify themselves out of some concerns of not having federal protections, so not having to out themselves at work, but instead being counted by participating themselves. If we don't have that information, it's impossible for us to know, one, how well the industry is doing with its challenge to diversify, and then also where some of the weak spots are, where are some of the places that we can make improvements, and where are some of the success stories? What newsrooms are doing this well, are doing it right, and what behaviors can they model for other newsrooms that are facing similar structural challenges? So we've certainly had our challenges in collecting the data. The data is collected through a survey that is administered via email, so there's hurdle number one, because everyone gets too much email, and it's very easy to look over it. But then there's also been just outright obstinate refusal to submit the survey data in some cases. I received a number of emails that said, we're all white here, there's no need for us to participate, or this takes up too much time, indicating that being transparent about who is on staff and the communities that you serve is not a concern to the editors in a particular newsroom. So for us, it leaves us with the challenge of not having enough political will to be honest about who we are, who we represent, and the difficulties we face in being inclusive.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. We'll turn now to our audience for questions.
Sure. Hi, I'm Rochelle Ford. I'm the Dean of the School of Communications at Elon University. Thank you so much for hosting this event and participating on the panel. As you know, newsrooms are shrinking. They don't have the budgets that they used to. They're not making the investments into higher education that they used to, because they just, the financial structure of news, of media, is being dismantled day by day. And we're trying to come up with new ways of addressing that issue. So if you look at that additional layer of complexity, has it actually gotten worse in terms of the progress because of the layoffs and the inability to have people working full-time in various positions? Or has it simply changed? Or are certain parts of the news industry, like broadcast, which appear to be more diverse than they was when I was a child, are parts of the segment better despite the reduction in news teams?
So I can speak to digital and print newsrooms in particular. AS&E for a number of years, in addition to collecting the racial and ethnic makeup of the newsrooms, asked questions about whether your newsroom was going to grow or contract year over year, and that is data that the organization tracks as well. For a while now, we have seen a downward trend in the number of jobs that are being added to newsrooms. At one point in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a little bit of stabilization, but we're facing a number of indicators that tell us that newsrooms are continuing to contract, but they're also continuing to change. They are becoming not necessarily centralized newsrooms, centralized buildings. So as Dr. Greenlee talked about with her newsroom, it is actually a network of people around the country. So in some instances, yes, we see conditions are worsening as journalism staffs in traditional newsrooms are laid off, as digital startups don't find necessarily the kind of financial support they need to continue their operations. But then in other cases, we are seeing there are some opportunities for news outlets to grow. ProPublica, for instance, and the influx of donor support that they had after the election has allowed them to hire a number of new journalists and place them in places outside of New York. They've opened a bureau in Chicago. So there are still structural challenges in terms of the economic impact of the overall downturn with the Great Recession, and also the economic model shifting away from an advertiser base to a subscription base or a micropayments base that is keeping pace with our challenges with diversity. And I think, as you mentioned, it just makes the problem more complex than it has been in previous eras.
But I think there is some data, and you probably know more about this than I do. I've survived 3 layoffs at 3 different types of media organizations, and that's not necessarily totally uncommon. But it seems to me very anecdotally, and I think there are numbers to suggest that layoffs, Black journalists particularly, are more likely to be laid off than journalists of other races for whatever reason. And so I'd be curious to know if there's data out there about other racial ethnic groups and other groups of people who have been marginalized from being in traditional newsrooms. But certainly in my experience, I have scores and scores of friends who are African-American journalists who are laid off. And in one hand, what that means for me as an assigning editor is that the pool of freelancers, which is difficult, actually there are a lot of really qualified journalists who are now scrapping to do very basic stories for me, which is not something that I'm praising, right? So it's something that the pool is getting larger for people who really do deep investigative work but can't find that work and are doing, kind of one-off stories. So it means the pool of freelancers is bigger, but that's part of the gig economy. And so what does it mean? Do we as a media organization want to essentially exist off of freelancers? And that's a question that we all have to ask ourselves.
Introduce yourself.
Hello. Can everyone hear me? Okay. My name is Kintia Prince. I'm a graduate student in the Interactive Media program at Elon. And so my question is, what advice would you give to newsrooms that want to create newsrooms that look like the demographics that they serve?
My advice is to find the political will to do so. Ultimately, it comes down to the choices that newsrooms are willing to make. There are complaints about the pipeline being broken or the pipeline being slow. There are complaints about not finding people who have the talent or having to invest too much in those individuals only for them to go on to other publications. And at some point, all of this boils down to leadership having the political will to make the changes that they need to make to diversify their newsrooms, to invest in the individuals that they bring in and give them a sense of growth in that newsroom so that they can stay in that newsroom. And then it comes down to looking outside of the pipeline. I like to get away from that metaphor. I don't believe it was actually really accurate. And if we focus on the pipeline, it's pretty lazy. You want people to come directly to you. You're not going to go out and get them. I think about irrigating and getting more people interested in journalism earlier. So as an intervention, I suggest reaching out to middle schools, reaching out to high schools and showing them what journalism careers are like. And also reaching outside of journalism schools in and of themselves. And now as a journalism school graduate, I'm sure my deans are shuddering, but there's plenty of talent from other places, individuals with specialized knowledge that we need to be doing reporting in newsrooms. And what it takes to get them in there is the political will to do so.
I totally agree. So in the stable of writers that I work with on a regular basis, probably 80% of my writers are writers of color. And people say, well, how did you do that? And they're like, that's impossible. And I'm like, actually, it's not hard. It's actually not difficult. It's actually not difficult if you put the work into it. And when I say the work, I don't mean just showing up at NABJ every week, every year. I am on Twitter, even though you will look at my Twitter account and I rarely tweet, but that's because I'm reading other people all the time. I'm looking at the stories I love and seeing who is writing them. I am, talking at HBCUs. I was not an undergraduate journalism student. I actually was telling some of my colleagues that I was discouraged from being a journalism student, and I wanted to be a broadcast journalism student, and I was told that my accent would bar me from ever having a broadcast career. So, and I thought I would rather maintain my Southern accent and my identity than be a person who was denuded of that identity. And I didn't realize that there were other choices, right? But I didn't hit the right person. And so I also think I find the pipeline metaphor incredibly unsatisfying because a pipeline has a kind of a destination. And I think one of the things about pipeline programs is that we have brought people into programs and then we actually don't follow through on them. And so if you have interns or at our organization, we have fellows who are very early career journalists, some of whom don't have journalism degrees, at least one doesn't have a college degree, but had the experience. But we brought them in and there actually was a real possibility of employment. And that was incredibly important. So, if you're bringing in people, yes, the training is valuable. Yes, you may be preparing someone to go to that next internship or job if they can afford to have that internship, because we know that unpaid internships cost you money to do, right? So, but actually, find them a place within your own organization, if possible. If you're not willing to do that and spend resources to do it, then the pipeline doesn't work.
Hi, Cynthia, you talked about the fact that there are some places that journalists of color shouldn't go because they're not safe. And I know that's a practical reality. I do wonder, though, when I think about the tremendous...
Even though I've gone those places, so my mother would...
Okay.
I mean, yes, I mean, because it's part of the job, right? So
Right.
my mom is like, where were you? Because I saw you were reporting from somewhere, and I was like, well, yeah. I was out in the street when there was, what looked like some people called a riot. I thought it was a peaceful demonstration, but yeah, I mean, I still go.
Well, and you also said 80%, I think you said 80% of the writers that you hire are reporters of color, and they also aren't centrally located, so they're able to do it from their own communities. Is that right?
Most of them are centrally located in wherever they're writing about.
So I guess my question is that we're in Appalachia, and there's a real challenge in getting people of diversity, let alone journalists of diversity, to come here. And yet, if we don't have those voices, then the divides will only grow, right? So what can we do in rural America to try to bring journalists of color to cover the issues that really affect all of us?
So this is kind of one of the essential challenges. I oversee, with the help of another editor, our Appalachian Reporting Project, which we partner with 100 Days. And so we were just having a discussion about this yesterday, about what we can be doing better to bring stories from various parts of America that we don't often see. I'm going to tell you that when I get pitches on a daily basis from journalists around the country who want us to run their stories, and about 30% of them are from one place. They're from Brooklyn, New York. Not joking when I say this. The next place, there's a lot from Chicago, and there are, those probably are half of the pitches I get on a daily basis. I, for one, want people to be reporting from West Virginia, and I want people to be reporting from rural Ohio or Appalachian North Carolina, where I have roots. And so, but it's incredibly difficult, and then you drill down and you're trying to find reporters of color to do that. And so one of the things that we've had to think about was not thinking about the word reporter, but thinking about writer. And so distinguishing between people who have journalism degrees and people who are writers or want to be writers. And so part of our mandate with our Appalachian Reporting Project is that we know that we're going to be spending more time looking for people and also cultivating people. So if we have someone who has a story, but they aren't necessarily a journalist and they don't have a whole website full of clips, then we're not throwing you out of consideration to write something. We actually have had really good success, particularly in finding queer voices in Appalachia. And don't ask me how it's happened, other than the fact that we identified 2 or 3 people who we either had personal relationships with or we had a Twitter relationship with. And then once we published one person, then it snowballed and people thought, okay. And then also once someone said online, well, this editor was great to work with and I didn't have to explain myself as a queer person, or I didn't have to explain myself as an undocumented person, we started getting more of those, which is not to say that the pool is large. I mean, the pool, I think, is small. And so the other question is then how do we bring journalists from other places to do coverage on Appalachia? Like if we do want to do kind of parachute journalism, which I typically don't do. I'm from the mountains of North Carolina. I routinely see how people frame folks from the country, from the South, from Appalachia. So the question is like, how do we do that type of work in a way that's culturally competent? And that's like really the question that I don't even have an answer to, because I see how often people, one of the reasons why people got really interested in Appalachian reporting was that people were like, it's Trump country, which is like, and I'm speaking of funders as well. And so like, okay, but that's not all Appalachia is, right? And so we've also been successful in going to arts organizations and getting people who are participants in the culture of whatever space they're in to come and talk about their communities. And what that means is that we very often get pieces that are first person or are, maybe have a more literary bend than kind of your usual third person journalism, but it's given us a different sense of voice and community, and I think that's really important.
I think this is going to be the final question for us.
Hi, I'm Michael Grant from Reveal Center for Investigative Reporting. I'm really intrigued by this idea of the conditions for journalists of color. And I think one of the first things we learn when you enter journalism is that journalism is a tough sport. But there's also sort of this amplified look at what it means to be on the front line reporting in dangerous conditions. So I'm wondering, is there an opportunity for newsrooms here in supporting and maintaining journalists? Are there things being developed in that realm? I know tech companies tend to, very well support, their workers and wanting to get them to work. But do you know of any programs, and what are your thoughts and ideas around support of journalists and journalists of color?
That's a really hard one. And to be honest, I was just at a film festival that was about investigative documentary journalism in DC, and I was amazed to meet an African-American online security expert who specializes in helping individual journalists and publications get their security life together in all sorts of ways, whether it was like looking at your individual computer and seeing where there were holes in which people could enter, looking at all of your systems, thinking about what it means to protect people when they go out on an interview. And I have seen very few folks who did that. I know she thought I was a little nuts because I bum rushed her and was like, I need you to come talk to people in our newsroom. And I think there's an opportunity, yes, because I'm at a loss to think of like formalized programs that really do that and focus specifically on journalists of color. I can't think of any, can you?
I can't think of any that focus on journalists of color. What I can think about are some places that I would consider corollaries to the idea. I think about the DART Center that does work on trauma and trains journalists on how to recognize trauma, how to report on trauma, but also how to cope with their own trauma. I had a conversation with a friend just the other day that there's a business model to be made for someone who goes into the industry to counsel journalists, someone with a journalism background who would be interested in providing that kind of support, seeing if we could get some longevity in place. I see that question as an opportunity not only for newsrooms and for universities and for educational institutions, but also for the affinity groups that also provide support for journalists. An opportunity to look at the wraparound services that journalists in different places, whether they are in Appalachia or whether they are in urban centers, to find out what exactly they need, how to network them with other journalists who have either been where they've been or have experience in the areas where they are, and help them articulate what their needs are. Do you need mental health services? Do you need security information? Do you need access to just be able to get out of the place where you live for a weekend so that you can come back to it and continue to do your job? So I don't know of organizations that are already doing it, but I do see it as a huge, glaring area of opportunity.
So maybe you'll have to think about it because journalists' trauma is real, like, and especially at this moment, and fatigue is real. We were scrambling, trying to figure out what type of coverage we were going to do with this latest Health and Human Services change that was going to redefine gender. And as I said, we have the only known trans Capitol Hill reporter in the country. And she had to go and report on this. So how do you report on a topic that is critical to your being? How do you report on a policy that is supposed to deny your existence? And so how do we as editors say, when that reporter says, I'm tired, I've gone to a rally, I'm exhausted, I'm emotionally spent. Like, what do we do other than saying, take the rest of the day off after you file your story? We don't have a good answer for that. And we don't have a good answer for it now because things are back to back. If there's not one thing, there's another, and that's been consistent. And I also think that's strategic, right? So, kind of the continual policy war from day to day is very hard for journalists to cover.
Okay, thank you very much. This brings our discussion today to a conclusion. We would like to thank Dr. Meredith Clark, Dr. Cynthia Greenlee, and Also, Dr. Michelle Ferrier for joining us today, and thanks to you for being here and participating with us this afternoon.
Thanks for staying with us as we continue our discussion, Kerner Plus 50. I'm Othello Richards. Now today, we've been taking part in a discussion on race in America, along with the Global School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Morgan State University in Baltimore and the Reed College of West Virginia. Now here at the School of Communications at Brigham Young University, we have students viewing from the atrium of their Brim Hall building. Now joining me here on set are film producer and anchor Temu Smith, and BYU history professor, Dr. Cameron McCoy. Now, as I said, here we are now 50 years after the release of the Kerner Commission report. Let's talk about how far we've come in terms of what has been done and what has not been done. Now, Cameron, I understand for your dissertation, you needed to have a firm foundation on topics concerning race in America. As a historian, how would you answer those two questions? What has been done? What has not been done since Kerner?
Well, thanks for having me today. It's an honor, and it's good to see you again with us not being on the track together, with me chasing you typically most of the time. But what has been done is we've seen a definite focus on legislative matters. We've seen a focus on empowering social groups, and that has been great. However, what hasn't been done, despite what has been done, has been a change in attitudes, perceptions, as well as how we approach how these reform measures should help minority groups. And so even though things have happened and the policies have been set in place and the legislative reform has been landmark, we still are struggling with, as a nation, just how attitudes can change and how perceptions change, as well as teachings.
Mm-hmm. And so go back again, just backing up to what has been done. We know there was a case, Loving versus Virginia. Can you just go ahead and give us a little background on that case?
All right, 1967, it became legal for a black man or a black woman to marry a white man or a white woman. That was 1967. And so that was a landmark legislative decision that took place in the United States, which has allowed our nation to be even more diverse, right? And also has debunked many myths that we've had scientists try to say about people of African descent and who they are, and making a mongrelization of our society.
Right. And then we have another case, Plessy versus Ferguson. I was talking about separate but equal, but is that the case? Is that really the case?
So this is in a case from 1896 in which separate but equal came to the forefront, and although separate, the equality was never there. And really, I would argue that it's equity. I would argue it's more of an equity thing rather than equality. But what happens is whites will have the exact same facilities, even though segregation is still in place in the law of the land, and blacks will have access to the exact same facilities. However, it's always an economic issue that comes into play. And so although the facilities may look the same and function the same, they're not being treated the same or maintained the same.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. Temu, your thoughts?
Well, you know, I agree with Dr. McCoy, and also I would just like to add that I would add that in today's society, that perception actually has this perceived perception has changed, and because people feel like they get it, that is the danger of it. They feel like things have changed, and so because things have changed, and because we're people of color are no longer being segregated out, like we're not being partitioned off in most cases, then they feel like things are better. And because they feel like things are better, they're no longer checking themselves. And that is dangerous because things have changed, but they're not better.
Things have changed.
We have not arrived.
Mm-hmm. I know that as a film producer, author, I mean, you know a lot about LDS church history. So here we are in Utah, obviously. Yes. Utah, there are a lot of members of the Church of Jesus Christ. There was a turning point in the church history. The church has some history with race. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the history is, for those who are unfamiliar with it, at the beginning of the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons, they allowed blacks in to have the priesthood. Black people were full-fledged members of their church. And then at the turn of the new leadership, then blacks were no longer given leadership opportunities and no longer given the priesthood because of the curse of Cain, the perceived curse of Cain. And so because of that, with petitioning, people petitioned against this school, BYU, because it's a school that is owned and run by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And in 1978, black men were given the priesthood and they were given leadership opportunities, or that ban was lifted. And so moving forward, we've had, we just actually celebrated the 40th anniversary of blacks in the priesthood, or the reinstatement of blacks in the priesthood and blacks in the church. And so I think that was the question, what has changed here?
Yes, what has been done, what has not been done.
What has been done? Well, I can tell you, first of all, what has not been done is sometimes when we get through a period, we don't want to look back and we don't want to talk about it. And there's this shaming that comes with anyone who wants to acknowledge or give a nod to the past or say, this happened in the past, what is happening now? There's that shaming. So the LDS Church, after the announcement that blacks would have the priesthood and that the ban had been lifted, they didn't want to turn back and look back. They didn't want to acknowledge it. And because of that, there were lots of things that happened. And then moving forward, because we just celebrated our 40th anniversary, and when I say our, it's because I am LDS also. I'm a member of that church. But we just celebrated the 40th anniversary, and I think that as an organization, it was the first time in my lifetime that I've seen any organization in the United States collectively bring together the African diaspora and like all of Africa, acknowledge that black people started somewhere and that somewhere was in Africa, and because of slavery, we were, dispersed to other nations, other areas. And so the LDS Church had a celebration where we all were able to come together. We started in Africa, and then it acknowledged slavery, it acknowledged our past, and here we are, here we are today. So that was the first time that I've seen a celebration done of that sort. And I think that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is definitely in a position, if they wanted to start having it sparked a conversation, and we are able to start to move forward.
Yeah, I remember all three of us are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Some of you out there have probably seen these missionaries on bicycles with their suits on. At one point, I was one of the missionaries. I served my mission in Oakland, California, and these beautiful temples. In Oakland, there's this nice, beautiful temple on the hillside.
Right.
And you'll be surprised how many times blacks approached me and said, I didn't know I could go up there. Which amazed me.
Didn't even know they could go up on the hillside.
They didn't know they were allowed to go up and onto the temple grounds.
But that's the same way when I'm a convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the temple was right near where I lived. And I didn't think I could go to it either. So that's a very common thing, and I grew up in the Northeast United States in DC and New York. So those are things that are common.
Yeah, so you have to try to think about where did that mindset come from? At what point did they start thinking that? But I felt that me serving in Oakland gave me opportunity to teach them. And yes, you are allowed. The church is open to members of all races.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And has always been open to members of all races.
Mm-hmm.
They just, not everybody could partake in the priesthood and the temple ordinances.
Yes. Now, Cameron, you talk about, we've had our first African-American president, and now we're seeing this rise in white nationalism here. So in some ways, you're are we going backwards?
So this goes back to the two questions you posed right at the beginning. And they're apt to the Kerner Commission as well, which serves as an incredible blueprint if the United States would like to move forward in a more seamless way, in a more constructive way. But April 1865, in Appomattox, Virginia, there's the signing of the treaty to end the Civil War. And you have Lee and Grant there, Generals Lee and Grant representing the North and the South. And then you move forward 150 plus years later, and there are arguments over structures standing. And I want to be very clear about this. In the same light as 1967 and 1968, the reason why violence erupts is not because people are angry. It is because you have these symbols that represent white power and a white power structure. And that is what blacks are upset about. And so although we've moved forward, somehow the United States, being true to itself, and like most people, hey, remember where you came from. Remember your history so you never forget. But a lot of times that history can be toxic and tragic. And those are the parts that the United States, citizens of the U.S. need to move forward and beyond. So while it is heritage for some people, it is hate for others. And so that's what always has us get rebounded back to the past. And is always, now, and the thing is this, all three of us understand this. The history of the United States has this deep fissure, this deep wound. And it has wounds upon wounds and scars upon scars. And that's based on racial inequities and racial inequality, which built the United States. And it's just so integrated, we will never get beyond that. But how we move forward, how we exercise reform measures and legislation is what will allow us to heal in a better way. But that wound is just so deep, it's just something you will always have. It's like when you have a bad knee, you always know when the bad weather's coming, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's switch gears for a second now to Black representation in the media. So as we've been hearing, the Kerner Report was tasked with determining factors that led to the unrest in 1967. Now, one of those factors identified was the lack of adequate representation among people assigning, reporting, and editing the media coverage. So a survey this year funded by the Ford Foundation asked a national sample of 3,000 people whether they agree with this statement. And the statement was, hiring more racial minorities in the news media as reporters and editors would improve the quality of news. Now, 50% of white Americans responded yes, compared to 71% of African Americans, 71% of Hispanic Americans, 67% of Asian Americans there. So you see, African Americans, yes, they tend to believe we need to increase representation. Tamu, how would you have responded to this survey?
I would have responded, absolutely, we need to increase representation. And I also would say that, you know, it reminds me of Megyn Kelly. I mean, is that okay to bring up on the station?
Relevant in the news right now.
Okay, so first of all, there's two things I want to say really quick. When Dr. McCoy was speaking about racism in America, it would be crazy for us not to acknowledge the fact that we have a president of the United States, of this free country, who said that he ran on a ticket with the promise that he was going to make America great again, and also this week announced that he was a nationalist. Is that not alarming to us? Like, is that not alarming to people that he's a nationalist? Like that, you know, I'm not a globalist, I'm a nationalist. But does he not understand what that kind of, like what a nationalist is? Him being a white man and also announcing that he's a nationalist. I just wanted to just acknowledge that because it was driving me a little crazy here. But, you know, I think when I think about representation, I am a person that used to watch a particular channel every morning as I was getting ready and getting my kids ready for school. And then they brought over Megyn Kelly. And Megyn Kelly arriving meant the departure of Tamron Hall. And that was just really heartbreaking to me for several reasons, because Megyn Kelly came from a network where racism seemed to be the topic their jump off topic for me. And she announced on that channel that not only was Santa Claus white, but while she was at it, Jesus Christ was too. And never apologized. It was very offensive to many just many people. You didn't have to be black to be offended by that, because for several reasons. But She never apologized, never tried to make that right. And then they bring her over to this other network, NBC, and when I think about representation, I think about the departure of Tamron Hall. I started to look at other women on these that had these national platforms, and you have Soledad O'Brien, but she comes in for the special, like, you know, Blacks in America for the special reports. She's not there daily. You have Robin Roberts on, is it ABC? You have Hoda Kotb on NBC still, and Gail. What is Gail's last name? Oprah's friend, Gail.
Yes.
Like we know your last name, Gail, but we know you Oprah's friend too. But you know, just looking at these people that have these platforms. Also, Joy Reid. You know, she has this platform, and where is our representation at? And with a million Megyn Kellys, like a million women that look like her, white women get to see their representation all day long. Where is mine? And why did they have to bring that particular one over to replace Tamron Hall with, or, you know, meaning that Tamron Hall had to exit?
Yeah, and then we have this incident this week, the blackface comment.
Lord have mercy. And now she's gone, you know, now she's gone. But, and that was also inevitable because she kept getting away with those types of comments. It was inevitable that she would make another one.
Cameron, any thoughts on this?
When I looked at it, the one thing her apology interview was the one that really stood out to me. Where I think what was disturbing to me is I was fine with the apology. You knew it was going to come, right? It's a natural reflex to those types of things, especially when you're backed in the corner and you know I'm about to take a PR hit and a financial hit because of my comments. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to invite 2 black people on, a black male and a black female, onto my show. And I was okay with her apologizing. What really surprised me was just how so many people applauded the apology. Correct. It was a standing ovation. And I don't know why that bothered me so much, but it made me just recoil a little bit and think about, when do people start getting a pat on the back or getting applauded for making a very insensitive, bigoted, or racist comment about something and immediately or not terminated? If I had said something like that, or our incredible author and producer here, Tamu Smith, said something like that, we would have been gone within an hour. And I understand her emotional capital and physical capital for news organizations and channels in the United States, but that just really threw me off. And what she had on there were people educating her. I didn't feel that she had done enough education for herself to be able to speak solidly on that topic, that she had not sharpened her intellectual ideas about the topic. If that was me, that night, I would have been in my room studying everything and then come and said, this is what I have learned, because she says that. She says, sometimes I talk, sometimes I listen, and I'm paraphrasing, but she's like, yesterday I learned. And I would have just done that. I would have found every book and brought on experts about, look, what is it that made me do this? And she didn't highlight, I come from a background of privilege, which is why I made those types of comments, because she did say that. She said, well, where I grew up, and I knew that was coming, and I'm not about.
But you also don't get to make those mistakes. You
Exactly.
don't get
Yes.
to do that. You
Yes.
don't. You can never make that mistake and think that you're going to show up on TV the next day to get to apologize.
Yeah.
Like we don't get to do that. But also, we understand that we have to apologize. Forgiveness isn't just given to us easily.
That's true. I mean, I always wonder how fast she would have learned had there been an African American on the set when that comment was made.
And there likely could have been.
Yes.
But she's not approachable, because when you are seen as the moneymaker, you actually who's going to say something to you if I'm not your boss?
I'm going to transition a little bit now to telling your story, or telling our own story. Why is it important that blacks tell their own story?
As a storyteller, I think that, and watching other people tell our story, oftentimes they tell the story that they know of us. And the truth is that in white America, in this America, people who don't look like me, or people who don't or have not been in situations where they have been oppressed, they don't have to know my story, but I have to know theirs. They don't have to interact with me. I interact with white people daily. There are some white people that never come in contact with a black person. And sometimes some of those white people that have never come in contact with a person of color are oftentimes the ones who want to tell the story that they read. And sometimes when they tell those stories, it's told from a stereotypical standpoint. And so I do think that it's important for us to tell our own stories because we know the stories.
Cameron, tell me, you say there's some dangers in telling our own story?
Well, one thing, can I just add to
Absolutely,
what Tango
yes.
says is that's why 71% of African Americans and Hispanics said this is why the media needs to be represented in this way. The danger that comes in that is the three of us are here today. How many white Americans, white members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will say, well, I heard those three speak, so they represent everyone. So they told their story this way, and that's the danger of it. Because what will happen is we then will be viewed as, well, you were speaking for an entire group. The same way, the same pitfall Jesse Jackson fell into. The same pitfall that Louis Farrakhan falls into with the Nation of Islam.
Absolutely.
So all these people, the same pitfall that Al Sharpton falls into. And so when people say, well, no, they'll look at me, they'll look at Tamu, they'll look at you, Othello, and say, no, that's your leader. And we were sitting there saying, like, that's not my leader. I didn't even elect him. I don't even know him. I've seen him on television just like you. And I would ask this question then, who specifically is the leader for whites? Who specifically is the leader for Hispanic Americans? Who specifically is the Asian American leader that we all can look to? Right. But blacks are assigned because most people will see this prominent figure speaking out loudly, a lot of times inaccurately or incomplete.
Donald Trump.
And so that becomes the challenge right there. And so that's where I think some of the limitations are when it comes to speaking out and most of the time just not being completely informed.
Right.
Thank you. We're going to switch gears now, talk to a student. First of all, I'd like to thank all those who are watching at Morgan State University, at West Virginia University, and here in the Brim Hall building at BYU in the School of Communications. I'm joined now with Shai Andrea Jackson. Now, Shai, you are taking part in an internship in which you're putting together a newspaper and a website that is centered on minority-based news. Now, what inspired you to do this?
Well, see, I've been in Utah about 5 years now, and when I first came, I would get the weirdest questions, and I couldn't understand where these questions would come from. I would get asked, first thing, they don't know anything about me, are you an athlete? And I'm just like, why is that your first question? Why isn't it, what's your name, or where are you from? And I would get things like this all the time, and I couldn't figure out why. And so I started thinking about it, and in a state like Utah where the black population is so small, like almost non-existent, I realized that the only thing that they could know about me personally, my race, is things that they get from media, that they see on TV, movies, and everything. That's the only thing that they have to go off if they don't have a realistic or a person that they can experience and learn from. And so I created the news-based website to give people a chance to both hear other people's story, to be able to connect and relate to us, so we stop getting those awkward questions that you're like, why would you ask me that? And also to highlight minorities in ways other than violence or entertainment in the news, another light for people to see that I'm not just an athlete, I'm an individual and a person.
I can tell you, I've got my fair share of awkward questions as well. Now you were telling me that your grandmother, she has a different perspective when it comes to race issues involving blacks and whites.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I was chatting with her the other day, and we were talking about racial issues, and she said to me, she was like, well, Shai, you know that if it wasn't for the few good white people that we had alongside us marching and fighting the cause, the black movement would have never gotten anywhere close to where it is today. And I know this, but like just hearing her say it really stuck with me. And I was like, yeah, that's true. And my grandma, she feels that the reason why, like almost like we're like backpedaling a little bit because there's becoming this divide. Everyone wants to be pro-black or only pro-white. They want to identify with a side. And they're not actually focusing on the issues that are actually causing prejudice. They're not focusing on that anymore. And so by choosing these sides, we're just becoming more divided. Everyone just has their side and their perspective instead of actually taking on the problem. And so she explains that she doesn't think we don't even need these sides. We don't need them because when we were defeating prejudice and racism back in the day, it was non-minorities who was fighting that fight with us, and that's essentially how we got to where we are.
Now, you interviewed your grandmother yesterday or did a Skype. Let's go ahead and hear what she said.
What we've done today, I don't think Martin Luther King would be happy with it because he wanted to bring the nation together. But I've never been in such divided nation in my life. Unity was coming to America. Prejudices was being put down by blacks and whites together. And if we don't get back to that and try to unite our nation is falling apart.
It really moved me. I was like, man, Martin Luther King would be unhappy with this? Like, what? It's really special, and I really appreciate her insight because when you talk about racial issues, I normally only get one side. They're either, oh, I'm so mad at white people for doing this, but they never actually understand that that's actually what's kind of causing divide. And I see things that way because I was raised in a family that's my grandma. That's my personal grandma. My mom was raised like that as well. And so I'm able to see another side. I'm not saying that I'm justifying anyone's beliefs. I still get offended and I still get frustrated for sure, no doubt. But I'm saying that there is another side and you have to be willing to take on both sides and look at it from other people's views as well.
Looking from other people's view, you're telling me, so your grandmother recently visited you here in Utah for the first time. How did that go?
Well, so she came down and she was so excited to visit Utah because she has never really been anywhere. She, just the type of family I grew up, I didn't even travel until I came here for athletics, and we started traveling every week for track meets, and I was like, oh, I've never been here. I've never been to a beach, but I was kind of trying to let my family know that, okay, you might get some abnormal things here because we're kind of, people wonder, I don't know. And so I was like, you might get some stares. And so I kind of let them know that from the get-go, but until it actually happened, she didn't understand what I was saying. So we were at KFC, and we're just all having a good time. It's me, my mom, my stepdad, my grandma, just enjoying ourselves. I noticed that there was this white family sitting a couple tables down from us. And from the moment we walked in, I noticed it because I'm used to noticing it. From the moment we walked in, they were just smiling at us. And it wasn't like, oh yeah, you smile, you be polite, you say hi. It was like they were amazed with us. They were still smiling 30 minutes later at us. And my grandma, she leans over towards when we get ready to leave, and she's like, Shy, dude, why is this lady been smiling at me the whole time? It's almost awkward because it's no, it's not. What's going on? What is she looking at? And so I'm just you see, that kind of thing kind of happens here in Utah. Because we're not the norm. They're not used to just seeing a black family, and they're wondering where we're from and why we're here and all of these things. But if you're not a black person, you're not going to ever notice that, and you're not going to ever experience that. And so it's definitely interesting. She was like, it made me feel special, which is not how I would have reacted. I would have been like, that made me feel awkward. I didn't like that. But my grandma was like, oh, I felt like $1 million because she was amazed at me. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting take.
Then lastly, we'll talk about, Brigham Young University, like many other universities, has a black student union. Mm-hmm. It's open to individuals of all races. Here at BYU, you said there is one white male that attends.
Yeah.
You talked to him about why.
Yeah, my friend Hiram, he's awesome. He's a prime example of what I was saying earlier, that when I'm around Hiram and he's at BSU, he's placing himself as a minority. This is what us as minorities, black people, to speak for myself,
like, I'm trying to get away from being a minority every day because I'm living that life every day here on campus, every day here in Utah. But Hiram purposely places himself as a minority in our BSU. And I was just interested in why he decided to do that. Because we're like, oh, we don't like that feeling. And he feels completely comfortable and at ease when he's with us. And so I asked him, I was like, do we make you feel like a minority? Do we make you, I wanted to know if, it was two-sided. Like, do we also make you feel at BSU like you don't belong there? Because that's how a lot of people say that it makes them feel here on campus and in Utah, being a Black minority. And so his response was pretty interesting.
So we have a tape there with Hiram.
Or my ancestors were pioneers, his ancestors were slaves. And seeing that our family history, our current life situations are so different, but yet we ended up in the same place. I don't go to BSU because, I want to be with all the Black kids. I go to BSU because friends, not as like my Black friends.
So your concluding thoughts there.
Yeah, I totally think people like Hiram, like to me, when I look at Hiram, I'm just like, okay, he realizes that the first thing he notices isn't that we're a different color. He notices that we are people. We're both humans. We're both at BYU studying. And a lot of people, I feel like the first thing they notice about me is that I'm a different color, and then they start thinking about how I'm different from them. And that's why we cannot connect, because they just started off with the differences. But when I'm with Hiram and when he's with us on campus and in our events, like he wears Black Lives Matter shirts, and people always look at him like, why are you wearing that? And he feels completely comfortable. I don't feel like he's trying to assimilate, become Black. He's being himself, and we're all normal because we're people. Just treat us all the same. There's a quote that I just watched the Hate U Give movie, and there's a quote on there, and it says that white people thought they were making a difference in Black people's lives as well. And it just really moved me.
Thank you so much. It's always great to get a student's perspective, because our students now are tomorrow's leaders as well. So thank you, and good luck with your internship and your special project that you're working on there, Shy Andrea. And so, we'll now be joined, Tamu and Cameron. First of all, the Ford Foundation conducted a survey. In the survey, the question that they asked was, do you think media portrays African Americans more positively, more negatively, or the same as reality? Now, more positively, whites responded 18%, blacks 13%, Hispanics 18%, Asians 12%. Okay, portrayed about the same, the media of African Americans, whites 36%, blacks 25%, Hispanics 32%. Now, this last one there, do you think the media portrays African Americans more positively, more negatively, or about the same? So more negatively, we have white Americans 46%, African Americans believe it 62% of the time they're portrayed negatively. Hispanic Americans think about this 50%, Asians 50%. When you see this, what are your thoughts as we talk about media portrayal of African Americans?
I don't believe anyone's lying or anyone feels that their representation is incorrect. I always like to lead off with that, because they're not. It's their reality. It truly is. It is your reality. And all we need is, if blacks are telling whites this, believe us. Just simply believe us, because we're living it. But whites are also telling us, well, this is what we do not see, and that is their reality. They're not incorrect, but the media is able to splice and cut what exactly it would like to highlight. We see that in movie portrayals. And one of the things that I had a conversation with someone, I said, one of the negative things is that I said, if you were a movie star, Cameron, would you ever dress up like a woman, like Tyler Perry with Medea, or how Larry Johnson used to be grandmama in basketball, things like that? I said, no. I said, because I believe it would fill a stereotype. And I said, and I don't want to play to that, because it's negative. I said, and that is why I truly do believe Black Panther was such a success, because its portrayal of this fictional modern day king was exactly, at no time was he compromised, at no time was he unyielding, at no time did he fit an American stereotype. Now, I do know that this is in the fictional nation of Wakanda that has never been conquered by white colonists. I do understand that. But that portrayal was powerful in so many communities, so powerful that I remember just seeing Asians dressed up like T'Challa. I saw everyone just dressed up like I'm running around saying, well, you know, eat Bombay, and then running down and going to take on Thanos. But I think it's important that we see that that was a positive representation. And if we could have more of that, and when I say we, I mean African Americans could have more of that, you would see this tide shift, because that too opened up an incredible discourse within our nation, which is still going today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Tamara, you have some thoughts on this?
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with Dr. McCoy. I think that, you know, like he said, when we tell you that something is happening, believe us. But also, I think that it depends on you know, I think that sometimes when white America is looking at a television show or even the news, like when we say media, I'm thinking all media platforms. But and for this, I'll say television. We watch How to Get Away with Murder last night, and you know, you have the star of the show is an African American woman. But also, when I look at that, I'm like, well, I'm not a killer. She's also an attorney. She's, you know, she has all of these different things happening and going on, and so if I'm looking at that and somebody comes up to me and they think that I'm equal to, I can't even remember her name right now.
Viola Davis.
Viola Davis, yes. I'm thinking her character though. But Viola Davis and How to Get Away with Murder, I'm not an attorney. I'm not a law professor, and I don't have students that are helping me bury bodies. And so that could be seen as a negative stereotype to me, because I mean, she's elevated, but also she's elevated in doing negative things.
And there's this underlying current of her being a
criminal. Yes, even though she is an attorney and above the law. And so, you know, but I do think that movies like Black Panther and movies like my movie Jane and Emma, you know, that we are trying to buck those stereotypes and really just tell our story. And I remember when Black Panther came out, and I remember white people reading a couple of forums and Facebook posts and even some newspaper articles where white people were saying, I don't get it. Black people are dressed up and they're running around, and I'm like, Star Trek. You do get it. You don't want to get it, but I know you get it, because Star Trek, you have all of these other shows. What is it? The Warthoffs or whatever. What is it? See?
Going to be Klingons?
No, anyway. Yeah. Anyway, it's the little boy with the glasses and Harry Potter. Yes. Harry Potter. So people dress up and they choose a team. That's not even real either. And so we get it. We just try to act like we don't get it. And I think that sometimes those of us people of color, we are in a position to where we have to understand whiteness. Again, they don't have to understand us. And when we get the backup of white people solidifying what we're saying, that's when we're believed.
Too so much. I mean, we could sit up here and talk the next 2 hours, but
really,
unfortunately, we are out of time. So thank you to our guests, Cameron McCoy and Tamu Smith there. Also thank you to our audience who have been watching online. This is the final session of the Kerner Plus 50 Symposium, co-hosted by the Global School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Morgan State University in Baltimore, at the Reed College of West Virginia in West Virginia University, and here at the School of Communications here at Brigham Young University. So thank you all so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.